Welcome back to another episode of The Leader Within. Today, I'm excited to introduce Amrita Aggarwal. Amrita is a passionate storyteller and strategist, helping organizations attain an equitable and sustainable future. She envisions leveraging her energy and enthusiasm to influence positive social change in her community. She was raised by a theater family and attained a unique blend of education in fine arts and business, which has empowered her to become a natural facilitator and strategist, leading organizations into a more inclusive future, one policy, one conversation at a time. Currently, Amrita is an Equity and Inclusion Strategist at Bakau Consulting and the president of LEAN in Vancouver. Well, welcome, Amrita. Can you tell us a little bit more about how you discovered your passion and your niche?
Absolutely. So first of all, thank you so much, Angela, for having me on this podcast. I am so excited to have this conversation with you. A little bit about my background. To be honest, I never decided to be in the DEI field. It just happened. And now that I look back in my at my life, I see that everything that I've done, everything that I was doing led me to this point. So, for instance, I've always been involved in advocacy work in the nonprofit space. Like, I think since I was maybe 15 years old, I've been doing it. I've been volunteering with organizations, and I've been really passionate about social and environmental change. And so when I went for my undergrad, I decided to do it in English literature, but my focus was in race studies, sex studies, gender studies, all of that. And this wasn't a very conscious choice on my part. I just liked reading books, and that's why I was there. And after graduating, I did some marketing jobs, but I wasn't really happy. So I decided, well, I want to learn more, and I decided to get a business degree. So that was my master's at UBC Sauder School of Business. And even after that, it did not click for me. I was doing these jobs and I wasn't really happy. I was in a toxic environment as well, and it just really diminished my spirit. And I just took a pause at that time and just, decided to not go for full-time work for some time and just start with contracts. And then somehow out of the blue, I started getting more diversity, equity, and inclusion contracts. And then I was like, how do I know this? How do I have this knowledge? Where did it come from? But then I look back, it's everything that I've studied. So my undergrad was what taught me about these different aspects of intersectionality, about race. We learned about, Indigenous relations in Canada even at the university. And I wasn't really doing it consciously. I was just doing it. It was coursework. And then I came here, and it's all so relevant. And then my business degree ties into the consulting aspect of it, how to tie it to business operations, and just overall, like the education side, it perfectly amalgamated everything for me to be here. And of course, like my lived experience every day that leads me to this work, like recently, 2 days ago, actually, like I had this incident happen to me in the bus. Like the bus was really crowded. There was just one seat next to me. And this white man sat next to me, but he was very uncomfortable. I don't know why. And the minute another seat opened next to a white woman, he just stood and then went there to sit. And I kept thinking about that experience, and of course it brings up a lot of emotions. I checked, was I smelling? I wasn't, like I make sure to like smell good, to feel good. But honestly, there wasn't anything I could do about it. And that's kind of the reason why I keep coming back to this work, because these small, small things, you can keep ignoring it, but they don't ignore you. And it just builds and builds and builds for so many of us, and I know you can recount so many of these experiences. So I guess all of that has led me to this work.
First of all, I'm sorry that you had that experience on the bus. I find that very interesting when those behaviors happen. And I feel like sometimes I wonder if like world events influence some of those behaviors for people unconsciously and subconsciously. Because from my end, I noticed that, like, I know this is a little bit sidetracking, but during 2020, when there was a blame on China for like coronavirus, etc. I'm like, oh shit, like I'm Asian. I may not be from China, but like there's people can't tell the difference sometimes. And I was worried, like genuinely worried for my safety and my family's safety as we went out, because a lot of Asian people were just being randomly attacked all over, right? So yeah, totally, those lived experiences definitely influence like how we approach work and everything. So from your perspective, based on the trajectory of your career, what are some attributes of leaders that have influenced your success?
There's just so many things. And I think all the leaders who've helped me get to this point have been so instrumental to my success, if I can call it that, and not sound too proud. But really, they've been so supportive. And every single person that I've met, I've counted them as my mentor, as a leader, because they've stopped me in my tracks and made me really question everything. The leaders I go to and ask them, hey, I'm struggling with this problem. I don't know what to do. And every single one of them has never given me an answer. And it frustrates you when somebody's not just going to give you the answer, but they're like, hey, how would you do this? Okay, let's look at it from a different perspective. So if this were the situation, what would you do? And then they make it so easy. And, it's through these exercises I've done with these people that I've become good at problem solving and even critical thinking. I'm sitting here, and now that I have problems, I don't have to rush every time to my mentors like, hey, I need help, because I know what they're going to say and I can really imbibe that. And even more than that, they have been advocates for me. Some of them share my race, some don't. Some share my gender, some don't. And there have been so many different mentors in my life, but all of them have been my sponsors. They've been my advocates and mentors. And it is so important as a leader for you to be all three. So you can't just be giving me advice, and then when it comes time to speak up and share about me or my qualities, when you are silent, well, then I don't believe in you as a leader. I need people to be able to advocate for me, because like I talk a lot about this, but I'm not going to be invited to the table. It just doesn't happen, and it's really hard. So if you are at the table, I need you to advocate for me, and I'll come in, I'll do my job, but I need that first step for somebody else to help me with it. All of these leaders have done that for me, and I've been so grateful for them. And I see that with other folks as well, in my team, they are being advocated for. And I hope that, my advocacy and my sponsorship also helps somebody else, because it's all about giving back and just paying it forward.
Amazing. And you touched on two key things there. One of which I wanted to zoom in on is when you mentioned I actually appreciate that they took a step back and be like, so what would you do? Because I think that is one of the biggest things when it comes to employee engagement and diversity, equity, inclusion, is including those who are actually going through it and not just giving them like a hypothetical strategy that might work, right? Mm-hmm. So it's really that piece of it. And then, like you said, by them taking that step back, next time when you go into that room, before you have that conversation, you're going to be prepared with by saying, yep, like I thought about this, this, and this, like now what do you think? And then I think that creates trust and appreciation on their end as well, right? In your skills and your abilities. And then the other piece of it that you mentioned is the advocacy piece, right? Because like you said, I'm not always going to be invited to the table. So how have you gotten good at advocating for yourself, especially in a toxic environment?
Mm-hmm. Oh my gosh, that question is just so difficult, because like I mentioned, I have been in toxic spaces, and one thing that I've really started to notice in that environment is that whatever privileges that you have, they're just going to be taken away very easily in that space. And just toxic environment, whether it's a micromanaging leader, whether it's microaggressions, all of that really adds up. And to be honest, I have never really been able to advocate for myself in that environment, because I don't feel that psychological safety to be able to do it, right? I need to be able to feel safe, to feel welcomed, to feel included, to advocate for myself. I need that environment. And that's true for so many of us. And I can, cite research maybe and say that, hey, these are the things you should do, but realistically we're not going to be able to do those things because we're just fighting for survival. We are just fighting to not be hurt every time. We're fighting to just even be heard, with a micromanaging leader. That was one of my biggest issues, that okay, how do I even communicate that I can do this job without being questioned 10, 20 times. So I would say, like, there is really no space for advocacy in those cultures or environments.
I totally hear you on that piece of like you're just fighting to survive at that point, right? And I think that's where that DEI work is really important, especially when there's that like microaggressions are involved, right? Because I think that is such a delicate dance that people have to navigate from an office politics perspective, right? And it's not an easy one to navigate. And like you said, there's no textbook that has a solution for everything because it's context specific. And it's also that piece where it's like, do you even have the luxury to step away from that environment, or are you financially bound to that opportunity in the meantime, right? So there's a lot to take into consideration.
Mm-hmm.
And so I know that one of your zones of genius is that diversity, equity, and inclusion space. So I guess for you, what has been one of your biggest epiphanies to date out of all the work that you've done in this space?
There have been a lot, but I think one thing that I keep coming back to is how precarious this work is. We're always fighting, we're always trying to get these piecemeal things from the leadership, from your HR, from the government, from our countries, right? And then like in a minute, all of that can change. You can be given something and that can be taken away from you. Think of the US, right? As something as simple and basic as a human right to get an abortion, right? That is something that's taken away from you, something that should be your choice and your choice only. And you see that that's a big part of the debate, that each time the administration changes, you might not have that right. So you plan your life around that, right? And with DI work, we can go as micro as an organization or macro as our whole world, but that's just it, right? Those things that we have, these spaces that have been open for us, they can very easily be closed again. And I think that's something that scares me, even that even when we have all of this, is it true that we have it and we're going to have it forever, or is that just going to be taken away at the whim of one person or one organization?
Yeah, it's a heavy topic that you had alluded to right there about the whole abortion piece. Because as a woman, I'm just like, oh my gosh, I cannot imagine if I were put in a situation where one, I didn't even have the choice to bring a life into this world, and then the second piece of it is then, well, what happens to that life, right? Like, I think it's not fair. And when it comes to the DI work, I know some organizations are better than others, where they're like, even prior to Black Lives Matter movement, even prior to governments mandating that, hey, you should do more of this work, here's the funding for it. Some organizations were really good at, okay, well, how do we just understand that the diversity of thoughts and experiences are great for managing change, adapting, staying resilient, and innovating? So what are attributes of those organizations that you've noticed that, hey, like, you know what, even if the policies were to go away, they still prioritize because of blank?
I think they prioritize because they lead from a people perspective. That is so important. And I think that's just one of the basic things we're taught in any school that you go to. It's all about people, right? And I get it that some organizations are so fixated on the bottom line that they're not opening up and seeing the value of people and the diversity that everybody brings. And it's not just race or gender that you can see, or like sexuality. It's so many other things. Every single experience that you've had in your life is diversity, is something different from what I would have gone through. We could have been living in the same neighborhood, we could have grown up together, right? And our experiences would still be different, because that is what diversity is. And I think people just are not able to grasp that. And these organizations who've been leading from a people perspective are so good at tapping into that, realizing the value, right? Like I remember in ninth grade reading about human capital, right? Not to put human value into like monetary terms, but realizing the value that people bring, because nothing is going to work if people aren't on board with you. And people are not just the people in your organizations. Sure, they're important, but it's also people who are your customers, people who are in your community. So if you've set up a factory in my community, I'm that people affected, even if I don't buy from you or if I'm not directly affected by your processes, right? All of that. So if you're not thinking about the people, if you're not caring about that, caring about all these stakeholders, then this conversation is really moot. Like you can go ahead and go to profits, but at some point you are going to hit that wall, because there's been so much research done on the subject that diversity breeds creativity and it leads to profit. Because yes, like at the end of the day, I know we're all trying to make money, we're trying to survive, so that is an important aspect we can't ignore, but realizing how people contribute to it is so important.
I appreciate you sharing that visual of just when you open up a factory or whatever it may be in my community, it impacts me more than you think. And then I think there's a lot of grants out there that go back to, okay, how are you impacting the community through the business that you have, right? And I think that's where that people-centered focus comes in first. And I guess from your perspective in the consulting work that you've done, how have you advised leaders on creating a people first environment, understanding that you're not going to enable, like you don't want to enable behavior that is non-productive and non-conducive to the overall goal, but it's also about caring for people as the humans so that you can embrace that diversity that's on your team.
Absolutely. And I think most of it is about listening to people, listening to what they have to say, listening to their opinions about like what's working, what's not working, and then being able to implement that, right? So your processes could be brilliant, but if your people are not happy with it, if they're not satisfied with it, they're just coming into work and they're going to be looking for other jobs, they're going to be distracted, and all of that's still going to happen, right? So do you want that? Do you want people who are not motivated? Sure, go ahead, keep doing what you're doing. But listening to people and building that trust, when somebody comes in and listens to me share my story, even on the street sometimes, right? That trust is building, right? And that trust is so important. And that's kind of what our work is centered on. How do you build that trust? So yes, you start with listening, but you need accountability. You need transparency, right? A lot of organizations, and I love that they're doing it, is every few months they put it on their website. What have they done about diversity, equity, and inclusion? And they also talk about their failures, because you're not going to be perfect in this work. Okay. It's going to take time. It's going to take effort, and that is okay. You are not going to get it right the first time. That is also okay. But if you're willing to learn from your mistakes, be accountable, be transparent that, hey, we thought this would be a good idea, but it backfired in this way. But we've learned our lesson and we're moving forward. And I think that's kind of where a lot of iterations come in as well, and a lot of work on creativity, on accountability, transparency, all of those big words. But at the end of the day, it's about listening to your community, because you are in their space, listening to your clients because they are buying from you, whether it's your service, whether it's a product, whatever it is, they are buying from you. They're important. Also, your shareholders, they are important, but people in the company also matter. So don't ignore the employees when you're just, outward facing. Oh, wow, we are listening to everybody, but then we forget about the people who are in our house. That's also important. And I think like growing up in an Asianized household, that was something that was really happening, right? We always forget about people in the home, but we're always happy to help everybody else. And I think that's something that I've learned that needs to change. We have to make sure everybody's happy in our home too. And sure, we have to be community facing as well.
Really great feedback on that. And I think sometimes where businesses miss the mark, it's like when they say, oh, we got to do everything and anything to keep our customers happy, the customer's always right. But then who makes the customers happy? It's your employees. right? So like you said, it's a very dynamic environment and dynamic process, so you can't forget them. So when it comes to some of these DEI related initiatives, there's the people aspect and the people behaviors, but then there's also the system side, right? So if the systems don't change, but the people change, the change is not going to last. But it's almost like a partnership between them, right? So from your observation, what would you say is one of the biggest system challenges that your clients face?
That's a very good question. And I think it's just resistance from the system to change, right? Something as simple as asking for gender in government forms, right? There's not much change that had happened there, right? Like slowly we are seeing these things changing. But like when people are like, well, here, I'm happy to embrace this, but we're restricted by this. Or when we look at school districts and it's all the students advocating for, well, we want to learn about history from other cultures as well. But then it's the syllabus you can't change. And even if the district wants to, they don't decide on the syllabus, right? So there's this hunger from students wanting to learn more. So they learn a lot about world wars, right? 1 and 2, and they go too much in depth and they're like, well, we want more. We want to learn about something else too. Please don't center it around these 2 or 3 countries. What about this country? What were they doing when this was happening? How often do you learn about what was happening in China? How often do you learn about what was happening in India at that time? We don't. And that's what they wanted as a change. But then the system is so unwilling. But like you see, like in the last few years, the syllabus has changed. It has come like a long, long way, but there's still so much to be done. And I think the biggest problem is that slow change that happens. And that makes people frustrated because they want results right now. They want to see it right now. So if I have this need now, this should be addressed now. But the system just don't work in that way right now. Like there's so many iterations that have to go, and there's just slow change happening that it frustrates people. And I also fear that it loses momentum on the people side, right? Like when they're saying there's no change happening here, even if it's like still slow change happening for them, it's just so minuscule, it's nothing. And then we lose the motivation to keep working or keep doing it because like, oh, well, if they're not going to do it, why should we? Right? The same thing like how like people talk about, oh, why should I throw out, recycles in the bin it's supposed to go into when the corporations are not going to bother. But it's just, if everybody thought like that, then what would we have in our hands, right? So it's just that dynamic of thinking that what you do matters as well. Like even if the system's not changing at the pace you want it to, what you are doing still matters.
That's a really great call because when you mentioned the whole recycling thing, I kind of chuckled to myself because I'm like, I know a lot of people who have the same sentiment, right? And then also the whole like, I don't want to spend not me as an I, but like they will say, I don't want to spend 15 minutes standing in front of 3 bins trying to figure out what goes where, and then if this is not clean I can't do that, and then it's just like this vicious cycle, and eventually there's like, I'll just put it all in one and then someone else can figure out, right? But when it comes to change in the workplace, that's not how it works. It should not fall all on the DEI specialist, the leader, or the HR person. It's a collective approach to it, right? And I guess what would you say is one of the biggest leadership challenges when it comes to implementing DEI related initiatives?
I think for leaders, I fear that there is a lot of fear that they have when they're trying to implement anything related to DEI because they don't want to rock the boat. They still want to see the change, but they fear that how would X department or X people react to this? What would they say when we do this? And there's just so much balancing that they have to do. And unfortunately, it's usually on one person, because they're the face and they get the biggest backlash too. And like one thing that you cannot avoid when you bring about change is resistance. People will resist to an accounting software. People will find a way to resist to anything. And that's just natural. That's just who we are as human beings. And I think leaders fear that resistance a lot. And like by wanting to keep so many people happy, they end up alienating the most marginalized and racialized folks in their offices, in their organizations, companies. And then ultimately, of course, those folks leave, as a direct result of that. So I think that's what they fear, how to balance. And it is not going to be a balancing act because we are working from a perspective of equity, which means that you're going to be giving more to some people just so that we can go and balance the scale so we have equality. That's why that diagram exists, that we see all around equity versus equality. People don't get that this is what it means, that some policies now are going to favor us for some time so that we can balance the scales. And I think that's something that leaders have a hard time doing.
Fair enough. And when it comes to dealing with resistance or even difficult situations in general, like just the call out there, that's your job as a leader, right? Like it may not ever be comfortable, but it's part of your job. And I guess I was reading in, was it like Patrick Lencioni or something where he was talking about when you're trying to influence change, there's generally three buckets of people: those who are always on board, they're gung-ho about it. There's those that, like you said, no matter what you do, you can never make them happy. And then you have the middle section of those people where they're on the fence. They're kind of seeing, okay, well, what is the company going to do? What is everyone else going to do? And then they kind of waver there. And he was basically saying is you need to influence the people in the middle and the people on the end that are going to buy into it, not the people at the other end where you're never going to make them happy. So I guess from your perspective, would you say that that has had like similar experience, or how have you kind of advised leaders to embrace the resilience?
I think I would start with understanding. Everything can really be understood and broken down. And resistance, even, especially for the people in the middle sphere, resistance comes from the fact that people are also equally scared. They don't know how this new thing is going to affect them. And that makes people scared. A lot of times we talk about privilege, we talk about being of a privileged race, and people think it's an attack on them. Well, it's not an attack. It's about, well, these privileges have afforded you this life or these grand things that other folks do not have, and that is what's bad. It's not you as an individual who's a bad person. It's just these circumstances that are bad. I think people don't get that. People are just scared to be thought of as the bad person, and a lot of like self-reflection needs to go into that, into thinking that it's not about you, and even if you've been microaggressive, yes, that's bad, and again, even if you didn't have intentions, you have caused harm. But instead of taking accountability, what people do is they go into a shame spiral or a guilt spiral, and then they become even more aggressive, coming on too strong. And you get where that is coming from. That's coming from the fact that they realize they've done something bad, and now they're just doubling down on it. But I think what's so important in those instances is to teach people how to understand or how to reflect on their privileges as not bad, but as something they could leverage to help other people. And the reframe really helps when you're dealing with resistance, because that's the one thing that comes, because people don't want to be bad. At least I hope. Most people don't want to be bad, and that's where they're coming from. And the number two thing I think where resistance comes from is that people don't know where they're going to fit in, right? So when we're inviting new folks into the team, does that mean I'm going to lose my job? And in most cases, I would say 99%, no, that does not mean you're going to lose your job or you're going to get less money. It just means that somebody else is also going to get a job and also going to get money. And I think the both and thing is very hard for people to grasp. So if leaders are able to have that candid conversation, just sit, talk to people, tell them why it's happening, what impact it would have on these people, it can really ease up that process. And you're right, there will still be people you cannot convince. But if you're clear and you're transparent and you're empathetic, because any change is difficult, like even if, your favorite, I don't know, ice cream shop closes and another one opens, that's a big change. And, that can be hard. And this is even bigger. This is a huge change that people are going to have. So just approach it with empathy and realizing that they're not bad people. They just don't know what their place is anymore. And for a lot of people, their beliefs have been their identity, and to have their beliefs questioned, they think they don't have an identity anymore, but they have to realize that there's so much more. So a lot of things going on. So if you're empathetic about it and you understand where the resistance is coming from, so have those candid conversations with your team, with everybody involved, you'll come to a resolution and you will convince those people, because at the end of the day, we're all trying to be good human beings and trying to do better for everybody involved.
Really great call outs. And as you were mentioning that, one thing that came to mind for me is the self-awareness and the discernment piece, right? Where it's the self-awareness to know that, hey, like, you know what, this might trigger me in this way, but then asking yourself, well, why does it trigger me that way, right? And then taking accountability that and acknowledging that I am absolutely okay to have those feelings, but it's how I act on it and how I impact the people around me is what makes the biggest difference, right? And I think it goes both ways, right? Like it's never on one person to be a martyr for everything that's happening in that situation. But yeah, I really appreciate you calling that out. And as we slowly wrap up our conversation, one of the questions that I wanted to ask you is, what does it take to unleash the potential of individuals and organizations? Like, what's the first thing that comes to your mind?
The first thing that comes to mind is psychological safety. Honestly, that is just it. So if I say, and if I present an opinion, if I present an idea, is it going to be met with openness, curiosity, or is it going to be met with resistance and just like backlash, right? If I make a mistake, are people just going to rain down on me and just be mean about it? Or is it going to be an opportunity for me to learn, right? And you can see in those little pieces how each flip can help me grow, but also the organization grow, because now I'm learning. I'm learning to be better and I'm growing as an individual as well. So I would say psychological safety is just so important, because people will fail, people will make mistakes, people will have ideas that are not really good. But to know that, you can trust your teammates and you can rest assured that you are safe in this space, you're welcomed, you're included, it won't matter that your idea is not good.
That's so true, because even tying it back earlier to what you said about companies like publishing on what they've done well when it comes to DEI initiatives, but also what they failed at. And I think the really important thing is like, well, what's the do differently next time? I think when a company can go do that publicly, it gives, I think, employees confidence that they can then do the same internally and ensure that when issues come up, they can actually bring it up and it creates less issues down the road, right? Because it's like the more you sweep under the rug, eventually something's going to come out and it could be catastrophic by that point, right? So, and I guess my very last question to you is, what's one thing that you're working on that you're most excited about right now?
In our consulting practice, we're working on a lot of projects, but what I'm really, really excited about is this new innovative project we're working on and how to implement EDI within some municipal departments in our districts. And it's just a new project, a new perspective, because, we've been talking about systems change, and that is one big aspect of it. So I'm really looking forward to it and seeing how that unfolds. What are the challenges we're going to see? It's all new for us. So yeah, I'm looking forward to that.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that. I can't wait to hear what you learn out of that experience, because you've been able to work with so many cool clients, including NASA, right? And just the municipal government in your area, and then also with the work that you're doing with LEAN IN Vancouver. I think it's really neat because you kind of get a flavor of, well, what are some of the biggest things that some of the women in our network is encountering, right? And how do we as a community tackle that together? So I'm excited for people to stay in touch with you and keep up with the work that you're doing. And to everyone else who's tuned in to another episode, thank you so much for your time and your attention. It means more to me than you'll ever know. And I can't wait to stay connected with you in the next episode. Till then, stay safe.